Most of you have probably heard when you got started painting to remember to thin your paints. Well, very few people actually tell you how to thin your paints. But in this video I'm going to show you exactly what it means and what the difference will be between thinning your paints and not thinning your paints. Hello imaginary YouTube friends! In this video I am going to show you exactly how to thin your paints. The reason why so many people will tell you to thin your paints is because when you apply a thick coat of paint straight from the pot, it will cover up the details, it will look sloppy, you will see brush strokes, and just in general it is not a good idea. It's quite glaring visually to see it. It looks ugly. So something especially important, if you are trying to do highlights and you are not thinning your paint properly, your highlights will look ugly. When you dilute acrylic paints, or just in general, acrylic paint is transparent, slightly transparent. And when you dilute it, it becomes even more transparent, so the highlight will easier blend with your base coat. So thinning paints is not only very important for the base coat, but also very important for the highlight. Most people will say that 2 thin coats are the way to do it, but actually I think you can get away with doing 1 thin coat and maybe a wash. That will mostly be something you can do if you're trying to speed paint an army, because then 2 thin coats plus highlights plus the blah 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 and the frac blah, it can get quite cumbersome. So for painting armies, I recommend doing a thin base coat and a wash, and then sort of leave it at that. And then when you get time, which will be never, you can go back and sort of redo the highlights. But yeah, that is something you say to yourself. So let's talk about the right consistency. So I got a crappy brush to get the paint out of the pot. And I'm going to get most of the moisture out of this so we can see the consistency of paint straight out of the pot. We got some Nagaroth 9 slightly dry paint straight from the pot. And you will see what we have up here is too much paint, and as we go down you can see that you get some nasty brush strokes and it's not a real even pretty coat. So let's take this off and get some more paint, but let's put it on the palette at just a tiny dip of water. So let's go. Already we can see it's much better. We have sort of the same issue here where the brush is fairly loaded up here, and it's, as we get downwards it gets more and more uneven. But the brush strokes are much less apparent. If we painted this to 2 coats on the miniature, it would look pretty good. Sweet. So that's the example. So what is the right consistency, the perfect consistency to paint with? Well, most people will say something like, it has to be the consistency of milk. I find that sort of quite weird really, because if you actually put some milk up into your wet palette or palette, you will see that it flows a bit too easy, and that's I don't think that's the right consistency. That's maybe just a tiny bit too thin for what you would most of the time try to achieve. So what makes the consistency of paint sort of the perfect consistency is really up to what it is you're trying to achieve. But some of the things that I like to make sure is that the paint should be easy to load onto the brush, meaning that it should be easy to get the amount of paint up into the brush that you would like, and the paint should not sort of clump on the brush. If it does that, it is too thick. So make sure it's easy to get the paint up into the brush, and the paint should flow easily off the brush. So it should not feel like you're sort of trying to drag the paint around on the miniature. It should sort of easily come off the brush when you gently stroke the mini. Also, the paint should not sort of fall or pool into cracks and crevices. It should easily flow and stay where you want it to be, and not sort of fall away from the area that you have just painted. An important thing is that your paint should never block the detail on the miniature. So if you're trying to paint sort of an area with a lot of small finicky details, the paint should flow over it, but not sort of block it out. You should never have the feeling that you're losing detail from painting over an area. Then it is too thick. You might think as a beginner that it is important that the paint covers in one go, so it covers the whole area, and the area that you painted is the same color as the color you're painting with. But because acrylic paint is translucent, that is actually not the case. If your paint covers completely in the first go, and you can't sort of spot the primer through it, then it is probably too thick. If this video is helping you out, why not subscribe and get more of my beginner videos in your feed? So, here we have Lone Smasher Fanatic. This is just thinned down Nagarot Night with a wash of Druchii Violet. And this old chap here is not done the same way. His rope is really dark. So this base coat was not properly diluted. It was not thinned down, so it got really dark. And for speed painting miniatures, that is not really good, because I need to do a lot of highlights on this rope before it even looks half decent. I certainly think that the difference is striking, and it's much more easy to do the highlights on a miniature like this than starting with a very even but dark coat like this. Some will disagree with this, and that's totally fine. And for doing a single miniature for display or YouTube or what have you, doing it even base coats are probably the way to go. But for speed painting, not so much. So let's talk about the right consistency, and let's try and put on some paint. So we got a miniature here. Hello. So let's start by painting some of the rope. I'm just gonna take something straight from the pot, not too much. This is how it would look if you were painting for the first time and you didn't know anything about thinning down paint. It covers quite nicely, but it's also flat and it's not very even. Salami and mediums, and thin this. So this is sort of the consistency I would use for doing the one translucent base coat with a wash technique. A very thin base coat. And as you can see, it works slightly like a contrast paint would. Only that I need to apply two coats. This coat and then the wash. And as you can see, with the thin paint, it is also a lot easier to drag the paint around on the miniature. You can load up the brush and you will sort of have a longer time where you can paint. So it's starting to dry here, and you can see the dull coat up there, and here you can see the primer shining through. And if we were to go over it a second time, we will get a nice even finish, but much better finish than up here. One of the slight problems with thinning your paint is that it will soak up into the brush, and that's pretty good. But you can have it happen that the paint will go up into the ferrule, and that's a dangerous place. So remember to use this magical stuff, brush cleaner and preserver, to remove it after you have painted. So I think I'll just speed it up here. So I have dried him and I applied the wash with the Drucci Violet here. This is not very good looking, but the rest of him, it's pretty good. And for you beginners out there, this technique will give you a decent finish just with the base coat and the wash. And not only that, but it will also give you some guidance as to how to apply highlights. That can give you a much more decent look with less time invested. So all of these guys are basically just a light base coat with a wash. You can get some pretty decent results with good basing and a few rust techniques and just basic base coats and washes. So there's really no excuse to not sort of get an epic army out. Okay, I have been talking quite a lot about how to thin your paints and how to sort of go about it and what to remember. But what are your sort of, what is it that you really struggled with? What is it that you think beginners would like to hear or need to hear in order to better sort of ramp them up to a nice, good level? Before I let you go, just remember that practice is key. Try and get a habit of thinking about the consistency of your paint as another tool in your box. So, depending on the paint's consistency, you can do a lot of different things. So play around with it and see what it is you prefer, depending on if you need to speed paint or do some really amazing miniatures. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe. I have plenty more beginner tips and it will be sweet. Nope, thin your paints.